Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Mark Burdell, for having suggested that I give that talk here.
Hold on. There we go.
Oh, all right.
Volume.
Oh,
There we go.
all right. Thank you, Lisa. And thank you all for coming to this talk. I'll do what I can to sum up what I know. And my family, my credential for doing the talk is that my family has been here for it seemingly ever. My father came here in 1926 from McAllen, Texas, as a student, and graduated in 1930, and a year later came back to teach Spanish, Portuguese, eventually Latin American literature. He was the chairman of the modern language department. He was the tennis coach and the fencing coach for many years. And just about the time he formally retired, I was offered the job as director of Notre Dame Press. I was at the time at the University of Michigan Press. I never went to one of their games, ever. And so I gladly accepted and came home. And so we've been here since 1926. And we know where the bodies are. And I'll share some of that with you. You know, you can tell almost everything you need to know about an organization by understanding the life and times of the person who is the founder of that organization, whether it be a business or anything. Check the founder out. See what spirit he left with the organization that he or she founded. In our case, listen to this. Father Edward Soren was ordained for just about a year, wanted to be a missionary, wanted to come to North America, and he wanted to start a school. And so he pushed and pushed and pushed in this young organization called the Congregation of a Holy Cross. And they finally said, the only way we're going to get him to stop is to put him on a ship and send him over there. So he got here, and he came, and 5 brothers came with him. And when they landed in New York, they proceeded to Vincennes, Indiana, which is in the southern part of Indiana. And the bishop there had said he wouldn't mind having some missionaries. And Father Soren said, I want to start a school. And they said, we already have a school. And he said, well, I want it to be a college. We already have a college. And by this time, the Bishop of Vincennes was saying, can we find something up north for this guy? So they did. They found Father Baden, who was a missionary here and who is buried in the log chapel. He was the first priest ordained in the United States. And Father Baden had some land, and he bequeathed it to the local bishop, and somehow or another, they arranged for Father Soren to get that. So he came north in late November of 1842. And when they got here, it was already pretty cold. And it was, the ground was covered with snow. And he could not see that there were 2 lakes on this property. The reason that it's Notre Dame du Lac, which is Notre Dame of the Lake, they didn't know there were 2. There was a kind of marsh in between the 2 lakes where the community house, Columba Hall, is now. And that marsh later played out in the sense that early students here, a number of them came down with very, very bad illnesses, and it was traced back to that marsh. And Father Soren asked the person who owned the drainage situation, could they please do something about the marsh? And the guy just didn't want to respond well, so at a certain point, Father Soren said, I'll buy it from you, I'll buy the land that we need. And the guy left town, and meanwhile, our kids were getting sick. So he sent some of the more able-bodied students over to bust down a dam that was blocking the flow of the water out. That's kind of who our founder was. He could have had no idea what his little school devoted to Mary was going to turn into. I'll jump ahead. Father Hesburgh, who had the dream to be the second founder of this place, who had the dream of wanting it to be the greatest Catholic intellectual center in the history of the world, even he would have trouble seeing how far we've come past that dream academically. But let's go back. So the brothers who came with Father Soren and others who joined set out when they discovered that in the lakes, in the bottom of the lakes, there was marl, which could be turned into bricks. The yellow brick of Notre Dame was made by hand by the brothers and the priests and sometimes the students. And they made so many that they began to sell some of them to people in South Bend. There's a house down at the end of Notre Dame Avenue called the Lilacs, which Notre Dame built when they, out of the same brick, when they hired their first sort of chairholder as a member of the faculty. But when this place began, it began as a grade school, a trade school. Maybe a couple of people came to get advanced courses, but by and large, it was just for kids. And yet, Father Soren, in 1844, 2 years after he got here and founded the place, petitioned the state of Indiana for approval that this was a university. And for a fee, Indiana said, okay, just pay the fee and we'll send you a document. You are a university now. That's how it worked, and to some extent, never mind. So launching a university with a few people who've themselves maybe gotten a few years of college is rather dubious, but they did it, and they continued to build. They set their sights primarily on the main building thing, because when the first building went up that was the main building, the two big wings, it's a design the same as it has turned out to be, were places where the students lived. And in there, there was also a place for them to eat, and the classrooms. It was all pretty much contained in there, with an overflow in the old college building, which is down by the lake, by the log chapel. So it gradually grew, but not fast, and they needed faculty, and they needed the word to get out that this was a splendid place to send your sons if you happen to be Catholic. Okay. More or less, word got around. More or less, more students came. But it really was not until the beginning of football at Notre Dame that the place really took on a different quality. By then, the student body was larger. There were more people here wanting to be college rather than minims, grade school or high school kids. And football brought us a prominence precisely because what happened was that the minorities, the Irish, the Italians, the people who were not being accepted on the East Coast, no Irish need apply, those people watched Notre Dame, heard Notre Dame, read about Notre Dame, winning over the big teams of the time. And their response was almost biblical. Those are our boys, and they're beating up on the very people who don't like us. And so a fandom began, and people started hearing about Notre Dame, and the major game always was Army. And when we began to beat Army with some regularity, it was like celebration time without stop. More on the Army story in a bit. Okay, so from 1913 right into the 20s, this became a powerhouse of football. This grew, and with it, with football's growth, came money enough to hire teachers, good teachers from elsewhere, and bring them here. Money enough to build the facilities better than they had been even. Again, with the same brick, Sorin Hall, which was the first residence hall at a Catholic university, was built from that brick, using that brick. Well, obviously the key name became Knute Rockne. Rockne was a student here, and when he graduated, he taught chemistry, and he was asked would he take over the football team. He had played football here, and so he said yes. And he was a master of motivation, but also of instruction. He was a teacher, and he knew how to teach the sport of football. And the more that the immigrants sent their children here, the more material he had to work with. Equally important was the fact that more and more people started following Notre Dame carefully and closely, and coming to the games and paying for admission. And with that, again, the money went into hiring faculty and building facility. Rockne became one of the absolute most famous people of his time. You can go back to that time, and you can see that the other peer, if you will, was Babe Ruth, Rockne and Ruth. Rockne often threatened to leave Notre Dame. I mean, he had won national championships, and in the late 20s, he said, "It is time for us to get out of Cartier Field, where we have our home games, and to build a stadium." And the administration sort of said, "Well, we have higher priorities than a big stadium." And Rockne said, "Well, I have no higher priorities right now. I want the stadium, and I want to be part of how it gets designed. I want that to be my stadium." Okay, it's also the beginning of the Depression, the Great Depression. So where's the money going to come from to build that stadium? What's really going to happen? There's a book published by my little company, Corby, that's just out by a man named William Riefsteck, who graduated from Notre Dame in engineering and went into a career in building, the larger kinds of buildings. When he graduated from Notre Dame, he went to work for a local company, building company. And one day he saw the workers throwing out all kinds of files from that company. And he asked people, he said, "What is that?" And they said, "Oh, it's years and years of files." And what kind of stuff's in there? Well, there are records of between Notre Dame and the CSEs and our predecessors, and it's all the negotiations, and it's all what happened in the building of the stadium. And Riefsteck got into the dumpster and pulled that stuff out, and he donated it to Notre Dame Archives. And then he mined it, and he wrote this book, which is called 2 Million Bricks, the Building of Notre Dame Stadium. Fascinating story. I mean, you would think, so what, a book about building? But then you get all this human thing about what was really going on with the CSEs. Where'd the money come from? Money came from playing Army at Yankee Stadium. That's where the money came from. And so here we were, the beginning of the Depression, bringing workers in, coming from all over the country. When they heard there was work to be done here, they came. So you have the logistic problem of how do these people get fed? Where are they going to stay? What's going to happen with them? How do we keep peace among them? Et cetera, et cetera. And we got 2 million bricks that have to go up in 7 months. And the laying of the concrete and everything else. Now, you know what? That stadium has held up really, really well. It's amazing. And it was built in 1930. Rockne only got to coach there for 1 year before his untimely death. But the dressing rooms, all those things that in old parks really got outmoded quickly, not here. Rockne looked into every detail, made a pain of himself, but he got it done, and he got it done right. When he died, they had the funeral mass at Sacred Heart Church, and CBS Radio came here. This was unheard of at the time. CBS Radio came here and broadcast the funeral. So beloved and influential was Knute Rockne in American lore. But now we're going to go back. We're going back to the 1870s, before football. And Father Soren is no longer president. He has turned that job over to Father Corby, among other people. They have elections. And Father Corby had been the chaplain of the Irish Brigade at Gettysburg. He had seen bullets going by his head. He stood on a rock at the Battle of Gettysburg, and the Irish Brigade was called and asked, "You're going in now. You've got to get in the fight." And he stood on that rock with bullets whizzing around him. And he gave absolution to all the troops, to everybody in the Irish Brigade, many of whom did not survive that battle. There is a statue of Father Corby at Gettysburg, and it is identical to the statue that is in front of Corby Hall. It's exactly the same. Corby was president when in 1879, the place caught fire. The roof of the main building is where it started. And it burned everything down except a part of Washington Hall, but the only building that really survived was Sacred Heart. And it was catastrophic. And this Father Corby, as battle-worn as he was, said, "I've never been afraid of anything in my life like I am right now. I have to send word to Father Soren, who is currently in Montreal, preparing to make one of his 30 trips back and forth across the ocean to Italy and to France. And I have to tell him that his life's work is gone, burned to the ground, all his hopes, and I've got to bring him back here to see it." So he sent someone up to get Father Soren up into Canada. They brought him back. He said, after surveying the damage and what was left, "I want everybody to go into Sacred Heart Church. That's where we're going to meet." Of course, it was the only place left, really. And he got up and gave a speech that is, I think, the iconic speech for Notre Dame and its whole history. He talked about what happened. He talked about what was left. He said, this was April, we need to build this place and have it ready for the fall, rebuild it. He said, in his last words of that speech, "If it were all gone, I would not give up. I must have done it wrong. I didn't build it big enough." So what we're going to do is we're going to build it bigger and better. There is what should be above all the doors in this place. Those are the words. If it were all gone, I should not give up. That's a spirit. That's the founder's spirit, and that's what came through. The other thing that goes to Father Soren is that when it was time for him to go to the next world, I think it was 1893, he was by that time living in the presbytery. I don't know, many of you would recognize that building, but it is behind Sacred Heart Church. It is above where the grotto is, and it was a house for priests. And Father Soren lived there, and on the Feast of St. Edward's, the students of the university came over, and they knew he was in danger of dying, and they sang to him, and they called for him to come out on the porch of that very building and say something to them. And he came out and he blessed them, which was the best he could do. And a few days later, he was dead. If you have time while you are on this campus, you need to take a walk down between the lakes, past Columba Hall, keep going straight. You will see woods, not totally different from what it was like when Father Soren found the place. And you keep going and you'll get to the community cemetery, and that's where the heroes of this place are buried. That's where the people who didn't have luxury and who worked their hands making brick and who taught as many hours as needed to be taught. And if you walk among those graves, and all there are crosses, it's kind of like a miniature Normandy. There are crosses, and no one is different than anybody else. There's Father Soren, here's Father Jerry Wilson, etc., etc. They're all there. It's an interesting walk, and it's a very touching walk. And some of the graves of the stones, the crosses on them, have gifts that people have left when they came back. There's a rosary on Father Jerry Wilson's stone, or a card, or something on various people's. So if you studied here, some of the people that taught you are there. If you worked here, some of the people you worked with are there. It's an iconic place, an important place in the life of this university. Almost from the beginning, teaching was of the essence for Notre Dame. They may not have been, in the early days, the most educated teachers in the country, but they were dedicated teachers. And teaching the people who came for their care was their primary reason for living the way they lived. That's another tradition that comes from Father Soren. Again, he wasn't an intellectual, but he understood the value of teaching faith and morals and literature and writing and speaking and whatever else needed to be taught. The person most usually identified as the great teacher in the history of the place, the greatest teacher, is Frank O'Malley, who taught literature here. Frank O'Malley was a dreamer and a great teacher. People vied, almost had fistfights to try to get into his class, because he inspired with the love that he had for the students. He inspired them to want to do more and leave here a different person than they were when they came here. Frank O'Malley was teaching in the late 40s and early 50s. And he coined the thing, the words, "Their blood is in the bricks." And he was speaking about all the people who had worked here in the early years, in whatever it was that they did, whether they served or cooked or taught or prayed, their blood was in the bricks. So have some reverence when you walk past that building and go to Sacred Heart and let it kind of get inside of you and inspire you. All right, we move quickly now to the Rockney years have ended. The football is established. There are better students and faculty coming to this place. Its reputation is established. And then comes World War II. And we are in danger of having to close this school. The young men are all being drafted or joining up for World War II. There aren't any students, then there won't be any income. We can't keep going. To the rescue comes the United States Navy, and they choose Notre Dame as one of the places where they will teach their midshipmen, not simply about how to run a ship, but educate them, teach them languages, teach them skills, teach them philosophy. I don't know, I can remember as a little tyke, maybe 6 years old, going to the South Quad and watching as the midshipmen, thousands, marched and raised the flag in full uniform. Most impressive. And many of those midshipmen never came back from the war. But because it was a central place for training midshipmen, students came from all kinds of other colleges and universities. And among them were a number of football players. Now, the coach by this time in the late 40s was Frank Leahy. Many of the people who played under Frank before he left to be in the Navy came back here after the war. And they were a different type. These people were educated in lots of life, having fought in a war. They were older, they were more mature. And as football players, they were some of the best football players in the country. And I include in that the professional league, the NFL. Leahy had people on the third string who, when cut, started immediately on a team in the NFL. He was a man who had played under Rockney, and he was a person who demanded perfection. Notre Dame, from the very time of Soren, if you were going to put one word up on the wall that you paid reverence to, it would have been the word excellence. That's what we're all about. We seek excellence. Leahy would have put the word up there, perfection. He drove those people endlessly. He would be up in a crow's nest with a megaphone, because they didn't have electrified stuff at that point, yelling down at them, "Do it again!" And he made them work on every play, sometimes repeating plays 15 or 20 times until they got it right. And he said, you don't really have it until you get it right more than once. So do it again. The players, the people that I talked to who played in that era all said, when we were here, we pretty much hated Leahy, but when we moved on, especially into the NFL, we loved him, because that was a piece of cake compared to playing football at Notre Dame. He would win national championship after national championship, Frank Leahy. There were some wonderful Leahy stories. He accompanied a man named Dick Szymanski, who was a center. This is in the early 50s. And Szymanski was summoned to have to go and testify in court about some accident that he had witnessed. He got subpoenaed, and he asked Coach Leahy, would you go with me? And he said, sure, I'll help you out. So they went to the courthouse, and Szymanski was sworn in. And the judge knew who he was, and so the judge says, what do you do for a living, Mr. Szymanski? And he said, I play football at Notre Dame. And the judge said, and what position do you play? And Szymanski said, center. And he said, and how good are you? And Szymanski said, I'm the best center in the history of Notre Dame. Leahy stopped him afterwards, and he said, what was that about? And he turned to Leahy and he said, I was under oath. There was a nun who came up to Leahy at one point in time and told him that her school always prayed for the Fighting Irish all week long. And Leahy said, prayers are good, especially when the linemen are big. He also, in one of the games, for some reason, Johnny Lujack was on the sidelines right at that moment. The game was still going on. And Bob Livingston, who was a halfback, fumbled. And Lujack said out loud, that son of a bitch, Livingston. And Leahy turned to him and he said, we represent Our Lady's University. We don't talk like that. So about another series later, Livingston fumbled again. And Leahy, who was always very, very formal, turned to the bench and said, Mr. Lujack was correct about Mr. Livingston. He had to put up with, anytime you have somebody who is that rigorous, as Frank Leahy was, you have to have the counterpoint. In this case, Ziggy Zarobski. Now, Ziggy was a very aggressive, wonderful lineman, a very smart guy, although he pretended to be dumb. Leahy once told him, as he used to do before every game, you realize that the guy that you're up against is a lot smarter than you are. He's going to be a Rhodes Scholar, etc. And Ziggy would say, that's until I hit him a couple times. Leahy couldn't quite get over Ziggy. But one day when they were out practicing, things weren't going real well. And Leahy got upset and he said, all right, we're going in and we're going to rehearse fundamentals. So they went inside and Leahy said, gentlemen, this is a football. And Zarobski raised his hand and Leahy said, Mr. Zarobski? And he said, slow down, coach, I'm trying to take notes. So, that kind of counterbalanced Leahy's approach to things. They used to have the pep rallies in the old field house, which was built like 1893 or something like that. And Ziggy Zarobski, when the players would come in, Ziggy was chosen by the players to give the speech on behalf of the team. And one time, he looked down and he saw in about the third row, Fred Miller, who was the owner of Miller Brewery in Milwaukee, who had played football at Notre Dame and who had his own plane and would fly down here during the week occasionally to help coach the team. But always on the weekends, he was here when we had a home game. And Ziggy spotted him and he said, guess you all heard about the United States government calling every brewery in the country and saying you need to send a sample of your beer to us to be examined. And so Miller, he said, so the Miller Brewery sent their sample. And 2 weeks later, they got a letter from the federal government saying, rest that horse for at least 2 weeks. Now Miller was a major donor of the place, and this caused some turmoil. He was embarrassed. He turned red in front of the crowd. And so Father Keogh, the prefect of discipline, called Ziggy in, and with him came some of the other members of the team. And he said, no, that's it, you're done. You can't, I'm not going to have you giving those kinds of talks anymore, and you're screwing everything up. I mean, those are our donors and so on. And the players said, no, Ziggy, we don't play. So they reached a compromise, and Ziggy said, all right, I'll tone it down a little bit. Ziggy also wrote a column for the Scholastic called It Behooves Me Greatly, which I always thought was kind of neat. In any case, Leahy's last team was 1953. It was a great team. They had a tie with Iowa, but other than that, they were undefeated, and they had played a tougher schedule than anybody in the country. And it was one of those times when we got robbed in the polls, and they finished second, even though they had beaten the tar out of USC at the end of the season. They didn't play bowl games then. And that was Leahy's last year, and he said later that might have been his best team because they were really a pretty remarkable group. Guglielmi, Heap, Warden, Latner on that team. There's a book out called The Forgotten Four, and the author of that book claims that was the greatest backfield Notre Dame ever had, which is kind of an interesting claim, but you look at the numbers and what they did and who they played, it was pretty amazing. But Father Hesburgh always was a friend of Frank Leahy, but he saw what was happening to Leahy, that in his early 50s, he was coming apart at the seams. You can't drive yourself the way he did and not. And so Leahy was let go, and Father Ted had to do that, but it was in the health interest of Frank Leahy to be out at that point. And when Leahy was lying on his deathbed, they called for Father Hesburgh, who was the man who came and gave him the last sacraments. Such was their relationship, firing notwithstanding. You want to have a great university, you have to have money. And until Father John Kavanaugh, we just didn't have a very organized way of raising money. But he started the Notre Dame Foundation. And Father Hesburgh was then vice president, began to look to Europe to bring some scholars over here to augment the faculty that we already had and to gain us respect from other places. So some people who had been under the Nazis and silenced under the Nazis came. People that were escaping Europe because of the communists in Eastern Europe came here. They started journals, they wrote, they published, and they inspired. And that was a quantum jump. Father Hesburgh became president in 1952. And he understood the need for that all to happen if we were going to become what he dreamed, which was very much like the Sorbonne in Paris in the 13th century, the greatest university imaginable. Scholars would want to come no matter what it was that they were studying. So you have the progress happening after World War II, after Father Hesburgh takes over. I want to stay with Father Hesburgh a minute. I don't know whether we will ever really appreciate in our lifetime what he is and has been for the Catholic Church in America. He told me one time that he had traveled, by his estimate, 20 million miles in his lifetime. He had taken Notre Dame to every place he went, whether it was the United States Congress, the Civil Rights Association, a commission that produced the Civil Rights Legislature, Europe, the Vatican, you name it, he was there. And what he brought back was a sort of cosmopolitan attitude. That is to say, he understood that the world was one, and he drew people people wanted to work with him. His philosophy of running an organization like Notre Dame was simply, you put good people in the places that you need to have good people, and you leave them alone and let them do their job, and they'll do it. When I was director of Notre Dame Press, there were two things that came up that just won my heart more than any other thing here. One was we published a book called Power and Authority in the Catholic Church. He smiles. It was critical of Cardinal Cody of Chicago for the way in which he used Bessemer converters on his priests. And the local bishop had been made a bishop thanks to influence exercised by Cardinal Cody. So he was not happy about it. And he came roaring into South Bend from Fort Wayne, and he said, I want the presses stopped. I do not want a book that includes criticism of Cody to be published by this press. And suddenly the politics began to mount up. Now, I'm enough of a domer. When that happened, I sent a message over to Father Hesburgh. I said, this is a resignation. If I'm going to cause a rift between you and or Notre Dame and the bishop, you can put it on me, and here's my resignation, and I will go elsewhere. That afternoon, I sent that over in the morning. That afternoon, I got an envelope from the president's office, and inside the envelope was my letter of resignation torn into bits. And with it a note that said, we don't punish people at Notre Dame for responsible use of free speech. I was knocked out by that. But it was 2 years later that I got a note from the very same bishop sent directly to me saying, I don't understand how you can continue to publish books that have relevance to faith and morals and not have an imprimatur in the front of the book. Well, in the university press world, that's not what you do. You don't have imprimaturs. You have scholarly readers that recommend it to the board, and then if it passes muster, it gets published. It doesn't need the bishop to assign somebody to read it and stamp it. So I sent a note over to Father Ted, and I said, I can't do that. We'll be a laughing stock. And he said, well, do what you think is right. So I did some research. I said, oh, wait a minute. That bishop's not hanging out at Borders and Barnes and Noble, waiting for a new book to come out from Notre Dame Press that might have impinged on faith and morals. So I asked around. I said, where's he getting our books? And my promotion manager says, he's on the comp list. He gets everything we publish. And I said, oh, that's easy. Take his name off the comp list. I use those examples in the sense that we had to mature as a university and as a place as we grew into a major university in this country. It's not exactly that we were country rubes. It's just that we didn't know how those dynamics worked particularly, and we learned. But I go back to the word excellence, and I go back to this. This university has over time made mistakes. Duh. And what has happened was that in the early years when mistakes were made, we did the sort of draw back, recover, defend, and not admit. But you know what? For a long time now, we've been strong enough and big enough to realize that a mistake does not destroy the pursuit of excellence. It simply says we fell short on this one, but the pursuit is still what we do, and we will rearm, and we'll admit our mistakes, and we'll learn from them, and we will go on. That's crucial, and that's pretty much the way it's been. St. Thomas Aquinas, who is the angelic doctor, was the person most cited in Catholic theology and philosophy, most followed. Built a philosophy using Aristotle, and it represented, in his thought, 4 causes of everything. There's a material cause, which is what this is made of. There's the formal cause that causes why it acts the way it does, why a tree grows leaves, etc. There's the efficient cause, the thing that makes it happen the way it does, that responsible element. And then the final cause. What's it for? And the final cause for Aristotle and Aquinas, what's it for, gave life to all the others, made them come alive. And Father Hesburgh, more than anyone I think I ever knew, understood that. When he would come back from his trips, he would report on them to the faculty and to people that would listen. And he always came back with something that he had learned. You know, that's what you do. If you go abroad and you come back, you bring back what's good. He represented us wonderfully, but he also brought things back, truths. And when people might criticize him for what he brought back, or how he would say it, or who he got it from, his answer was the same as the answer of the Dominicans in the 13th century when Aquinas was attacked for having based his philosophy on the pagan Aristotle. Aquinas said, and Hesburgh believed, take whatever is good, no matter the source. If only we in this country could do that, politically and in other ways. Take whatever is good, no matter the source, and work from there. St. Thomas Aquinas also believed very strongly, as does Father Hesburgh, in the common good. That's what drives a successful community, is the common good. And some division of that university or that company or that political party may have to yield something for a greater good. And that's called compromise. Please, Lord, send us compromise. So it's after Father Hesburgh's time, but due to his inspiration, that academically this place has taken off. In 30 years, in the last 30 years, the number of people and the quality of people we have attracted to our faculty is utterly unmatched by anybody else. We have. And where does that show up? Is that just that they write good books, that they influence thought in a particular place? No. When the grants come in for the great scholars to do research, that's where the students, the grad students, work. That's where they find out how methods and effects happen. What's really, so it's part of the teaching mission that happens. We, all of us, particularly those of us who are retired and who occasionally are allowed to address the incoming faculty, we don't have to play up the fact that they're great scholars, that we've drawn the best. What we need always to reemphasize, because we're scared about it, is the teaching of undergraduates at this place, because that's what made us great. Back in the years before we had these big graduate schools and the graduate faculty, when our people left, they were well educated. They got into law schools and med schools. And it was because they were well taught. So the university has a special center to help faculty be better teachers. I mean, we haven't lost it. We haven't lost it. And there is a realization as you seek tenure or whatever else. How's your teaching? You're a good teacher? Hope so. You gotta be, because what happens with the undergraduates is the heart and soul of this place. All right, I'm going to end now because that's long enough. I urge you to take that walk to the community cemetery. I urge you to stop in, as you would anyway, to Sacred Heart and realize that that's where incredible things happened. That's where Rockne was waked and taken to his grave. There have been countless weddings of Notre Dame students, St. Mary's ladies, etc., at that church. It has played the central role in the life of this university, and it's worth visiting and being humbled by it. The last thing I want to say is this. It's a little story, and I'll do it quickly. You know how sometimes if you're on the computer and you see something interesting and you click into it and it takes you to an article that then has a discussion, ostensibly a discussion going on afterwards. And I followed one of those having to do with something about Notre Dame, and I got to the comments, and there was some sardonic individual from Chicago saying, now here's the question. If there are 100 people in the room and one of them is from Notre Dame, how will you know who it is? So we waited with bated breath while he answered his own question and said, oh, don't worry about it. He or she'll tell you. And my response was simple. Damn right. Thank you.